Welcome to the Leadership Sparq podcast, where we equip you to be the great leader your people deserve. I'm your host, Hampton Dortch, joined by my co-host, Corey Towe. And today we're talking about something very important, the story that we tell ourselves as leaders.
And I firmly believe that the most important story that I tell is a story I tell myself. And the most important story you tell, Hampton, is the story that you tell yourself. And so you may be thinking, well, what does that have to do with leadership? Like, what does the story I tell myself, that narrative that is on repeat in my mind, whether I'm conscious of it or I'm unconscious of it, how does that affect me as a leader? And I would say it 100% affects me as a leader. And when I find myself telling myself a negative story, it absolutely affects the way that I think about my own leadership capabilities. It affects how I view the output from my team. It affects my outlook on the organization and what's going on, and maybe what the next 6 or 12 or 24 months looks like. But if I think about when I'm telling myself a positive story, that also affects the way that I lead, affects the way that I engage. And so that's just human nature, right? How we think ultimately is gonna play itself out in the way that we engage, in the way that we act. And so as a leader, it is very, very important to understand the story that we're telling ourselves. And it's very important for us to build skills to make sure that we are able to reframe the stories we tell ourselves into a positive frame so that we drive the outcomes that we want. And I know that there's a really impactful quote from Craig Groeschel that you and I have taught, Hampton, we've talked about a lot together, that we can share with our audience here that will help shape it as well, maybe in a different light. But the most important story that I tell is the story I tell myself.
Yeah, Craig Rochelle says that your life is always heading in the direction of your strongest thoughts. Your life is always heading in the direction of your strongest thoughts. I read that twice to say that to myself. And something that I would add to that is actually on the topic of humility. In the past, I have said, "Oh, I'm not qualified for this," or I can't believe I got put in this role," or I felt this imposter syndrome. And maybe there legitimately are times in your life where maybe you actually shouldn't be in a role. But I want you to remember that somebody somewhere saw something in you and put you in the position that you are today. And sure, maybe you're not qualified, but one thing that I want to talk about is this favorite, or one of my favorite quotes on humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's not thinking down on yourself. It's not having imposter syndrome and saying, I'm not worthy. Humility is thinking of yourself less. And whatever you're thinking, we hope that those thoughts are positive, because wherever your thoughts are, again, back to Groeschel, you're going to be moving in that direction. But I think that there's this element of even false humility that I've felt into as well, where I'm still just always thinking about myself. And so I just wanted to add that there as a little bit of a side note. But the go and do for us is to remember that quote from Craig Groeschel and ask yourself, where are my thoughts? Are they positive or are they negative? And then notice that you are moving in the direction of wherever your thoughts are. Start by doing that.
Yeah, and over the next couple of days, we're going to dive deeper into this idea of the imposter syndrome. And Hampton, I know you are a LinkedIn legend, and if you just go to LinkedIn and you look at just people and what they post, you'll see this idea of an imposter syndrome. It's on there a lot, right? People are talking about it a lot, and to me, I know that there are people listening to this that show up to work feeling like, or the story they have in their mind is either I don't have what it takes to be successful. Someone else could do the job a lot better than I could. I can't believe I'm in this position. At some point, someone's going to figure out that I'm underqualified or I shouldn't be here and replace me. Those types of thoughts connect back to the imposter syndrome. And so we're going to, over the next couple of episodes, talk about that and unpack that a little bit, but also equip you with some skills that you can build or practices that you can implement that will help you fight against that thought as it comes in. And so remember the quote from Groeschel. Remember, the most important story you tell is the story you tell yourself. Today, take some time out and just think about what you think about and ask yourself the question, is that a positive or a negative thought? And start there. And then we're going to, over the next couple of days, we're going to unpack it further. And today we're going to continue our conversation about the imposter syndrome. And in our last episode, we talked about this idea that the most important story that we as leaders tell ourselves is the story that we tell ourselves. And you mentioned a quote that's super powerful, that our life is always heading in the direction of our strongest thoughts. And we talked about how, as a leader, how we think and how we win the battle that's going on in our own mind ultimately manifests itself in our effectiveness as a leader. And so we wanted to spend more time around this topic of the imposter syndrome because it's such a hot topic, right? We see it all over the place in leadership conversations within either platforms like LinkedIn or conversations that we have where people are talking about how they identify with this thing called the imposter syndrome. So why don't you tell us what in the world that is, and then we can unpack it further, what it looks like whenever the imposter syndrome is raising its ugly head in our lives as a leader, and the impact that it could have on us as we lead.
Imposter syndrome has been around for probably since the beginning of time. I think it was first defined in the 70s. And the definition that we found is the idea that you've only succeeded due to luck and not because of your talent or qualifications. So there's really an expert on imposter syndrome named Valerie Young, who we'll be referencing some here in this podcast today. And what she listed was 5 different examples of what it looks like to be experiencing imposter syndrome. And we're just going to read a few of those for you. This was really helpful for me to see. So the first is the perfectionists. So they set extremely high expectations for themselves. And even if they meet 99% of their goals, they're going to feel like failures. Any small mistake will make them question their own competence. You're driving in your car on your way to work right now and you said, oof, that's me. Maybe you didn't.
Right.
But what about this one? Experts, they feel the need to know every piece of information before they start a project and constantly look for new certifications or training to improve their skills. They won't apply for a job if they don't meet all the criteria in the posting, and they might be hesitant to ask a question in class or speak up in a meeting at work because they're afraid of looking stupid if they don't already know the answer. Maybe some of you are like, that's me. I'll read one more and then pass the last two to Corey. So when the natural genius, that's the third. So we've got perfectionists, experts, and then natural genius. When they have to struggle or work hard to accomplish something, he or she thinks this means they aren't good enough. They are used to skills coming easily. And when they have to put in effort, their brain tells them that that's proof that they're an imposter.
And these last two, honestly, like these are the two that resonate most with me when I think about when I struggle in my own mind and how I think and think that I'm an imposter. I may not be defining it as an imposter. I may not be using that word in my mind, but I can feel these things or experience these things. And so the fourth one is a soloist. And the soloist feels that they have to accomplish all these tasks on their own. And if they need to ask for help, so if I feel like sometimes if I need to ask for help, it means I'm a failure or I'm a fraud because I couldn't do it by myself. And that's an imposter syndrome experience or pattern. So a soloist. And then the last one is you feel like you have to be the super person. And super person, people push themselves to work harder than other people around them to prove that they're not imposters. So they're going to work hard to prove they're not an imposter. And they can feel the need to succeed in every aspect of life, as work, as parents, as a partner, as a friend, whatever aspect of life, they feel like they have to succeed in all of those, or they'll feel stressed and feel like they're not accomplishing something in their lives, which ultimately leads to this idea of being an imposter. And so maybe as we read through those, there's one that resonates with you, because part of the process here is if the most important story is the story you tell yourself, and if your life is always moving in the direction of your strongest thoughts, the goal is to start to lean into and become conscious of how you're thinking. And so even as we read those 5 experiences that could manifest itself as the imposter syndrome, you have to pause and you have to think about which one of those may be going on in your life and how does that affect how you lead your people. And so the go and do today is that it's again to lean in and start to consciously tune into the thoughts that are on repeat in your mind. What is that narrative that is consistently going on in your mind? Because tomorrow we're going to provide you with practices that you can use to reframe and replace it so that you're thinking things that allow you to become the leader that you want to be. So tune in tomorrow to learn more about that.
Welcome to the Leadership Sparq podcast, where we equip you to be the great leader your people deserve. I'm your host, Hampton, joined by my co-host, Corey Towe. And speaking of the leader that your people deserve, they deserve someone that is not struggling with imposter syndrome. However, I know that so many of us do, Corey and I included. And so what we're doing here is we're going to actually share a few practical tips for getting out of this mindset. We've been talking about the thoughts that you have, the stories that you're telling yourself. And today we're talking about two words that start with R: replace and reframe. Reframe. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
You said it. Reframe. You got it. And to recap, we define the imposter syndrome. It's not really us, right? This is something that has been around for 40 plus years. In fact, been around for probably ever since there's been humans in this world. But it's this idea that you've only succeeded due to luck and not because of your talent or qualifications. And I think it's not a matter of, do you think this or not? Because all of us do at some point. All of us are going to have a pattern of thought or a thought that comes in that tells us that maybe somebody else could do the job better than us. Maybe we're not fit for the position that we're in. Maybe we're not really good at what we think we're really good at. And so the question isn't necessarily, did you think that or not? The question is, what do you do with it when you do think it? And so hopefully today we can give you two practical practices that you can implement that will help you take control of your mind, that ultimately lets you take control of the outcomes that you see when it comes to your thoughts manifesting itself in your actions as a leader. And so the first one is replace, and the second is reframe. And so replace simply is when you recognize that there's a thought that you have that is negative, or a thought that you have that isn't in line with what's true about you or about your circumstance or your situation, that you're able to identify, number one, the thought, and then you have a bank of truths that you go to that you replace that with. And so those could be accomplishments that you've had in the past that you refer back to. Those could be affirmations that you've received from your team or other people. Hampton said in an earlier podcast that at some point someone believed in you as a leader and put you in that position. And you can look around and see the followers that are around you if you're leading. And so you take that thought that may be the one that you want to replace, and you replace it with something that is true to you and true about you. And you go through that practice. That's a practice. That is a conscious thing that I do. If I find myself thinking the imposter syndrome thoughts, I want to catch myself doing it, and then I want to refer back to what is true. And so you can do the same thing as a leader. You want to be able to replace those, because the what's at stake here is that if you continue down the pattern of negative thought, then ultimately that will manifest itself in how you engage and you lead your team. And you may not get the results that you want as far as the outcomes that you want as a leader. And so the first is to replace. And I'll briefly just touch on the second one, is reframe. And I know, Hampton, you have a great example of this, but the second is to reframe. And reframe, if you think about, you take a picture on your iPhone, you take a video with your iPhone. When you look on your phone and you are taking a picture, there's a frame there, right? And what is in the frame itself, when you're taking a picture or doing a video, that's giving you the context of the picture or the video you're going to capture. And so sometimes we may have a frame of how we're interpreting the circumstances that we find ourselves in as a leader, and we need to reframe it. And you have a great example of, maybe not related necessarily to the imposter syndrome, but I know, Hampton, you have a great example of what it means to reframe. Why don't you share that?
One thing I was thinking about is so often I say, oh, I have to do that. I have to go to work. I have to do that project. I have to go to that place. And what if we started saying, I get to do these things? So if you are listening to the Leadership Sparq podcast, first off, thank you. Give us a review. No, but if you're listening to this, that is a big deal. Not because me and Corey are amazing, but the fact that you are in a position where a podcast like this would add value to your life means that you are in a category of people in the world that are unbelievably blessed. Like if you are a leader, if you are a manager, if you have a job, if you're driving in a car listening to this, if you're on a walk at night listening to this, like you get to learn how to be a better leader. And we firmly believe that everyone deserves a great leader. And the goal of this podcast is to position you to be great. And so I think a simple shift would be, I get to do this versus I have to do this.
Yeah. And so the go and do is practice these. It takes effort to practice it, to practice replacing. So if you find yourself with a thought that is leading you down the road of thinking you're an imposter, how do you take that thought and then replace it with something that's true about who you are? And then reframe. An example that Hampton just gave If you find yourself framing something up in a certain way, and it's not the direction that you want to go or the way that you want to frame things, reframe it with something else that's positive, because those two things will affect your actions and ultimately affect you as a leader. So go and do those two things, put replacement and reframing into practice.